Croissants are one of the hardest pastries to get right, and many people give up with good reason. Today we're sharing what goes into a traditional French croissant, why they're so difficult, and tips on making them at home. Welcome back to Good Neighbors Homestead. I'm Meredith, and this is my husband Wes. Since beginning our business and participating in the farmers market back in 2023, we started bringing traditional French croissants, and at this point, that is what we have become known for. This isn't going to be a shortcut recipe. This is just going to be understanding the process and what it takes to create traditional French croissants.
I do the majority of the baking for our market sales. Growing up, I spent a lot of time with my grandmother working in the kitchen, learning how to bake. And then as I got older, a few years ago, I took up cooking as a hobby. Wanted to learn how to do it better after suffering through many years of being not very good at it, as she can attest to. I found that I really enjoyed the process of baking and learning about the various techniques and just the sheer number of options and things that you can do with it. And so as I progressed in learning to bake more and more complicated things, one of the cooking classes I had was taught by a traditional French baker. And so of course, he covered croissant, since it's kind of a national thing with France. And I was just hooked right away. The process, the dedication, the technique that goes into it, and turning such simple ingredients as flour, sugar, and butter into such an amazingly delicate and delicious pastry is something that I found very fun, very fascinating, and just extremely rewarding. Didn't happen right away. First couple of times, there were some mishaps here and there. There was definitely some learning. So that would be, my biggest advice if you're going to try this, buckle up. It's a process. Very few people get it right the first time because it is very technical. But if you put in the practice and you put in the effort, it is very, very much worth it.
And through that practice, that's kind of how you've been able to really troubleshoot when things haven't gone quite right with the croissants, where the issue lies.
Yep.
Professor Griffin,
yes.
Explain to us what a traditional French croissant is.
Yeah, one of the most important things that goes into it is the leaven or the sourdough base. That's what separates a true French croissant from a lot of what we get in America, because a lot of croissants in America are just made with yeast alone. And so what you get is you get butter, you get a lot of those flavors, but you miss out on a lot of the depth that comes with the sourdough and with the leaven. And that's the part that's very difficult for commercially produced pastries to really do. But it's one of the beautiful things of it is it's a lot easier to do that in your own home. The other thing that separates true French croissants and true croissants from some of the other ones is using butter only. So sometimes what you'll see is there's two different kinds of shapes. You'll see the traditional diamond shape, and then you'll see some that are bent. So the ones that are bent use butter and another type of oil. If they're a true diamond, they're using only butter. And the butter is really important. You need a really high quality butter with a lot of fat, because part of making the dough is going to be stretching it into very thin layers between the actual dough itself. And the lower fat content butters that you're typically used to aren't able to stretch quite as well. The other thing is the lamination process. It's the folding. This is the secret, right? Once you get the butter inside encapsulated in the dough, it's stretching it out, folding it in on itself, and then repeating that process about 3 or 4 different times. And this is what takes dough from 3 layers, 2 of dough and 1 of butter, up to as many as over 100 very small layers. And ultimately, when baked and proved, is what gives the interior of the croissant that sort of airy but also chewy texture that makes it so good. Lamination process is where most mistakes happen. It can be very tricky because if the butter gets too warm, it can work into the dough and then you don't get the separation of the layers. But if the butter's too cold, you can get what are called shards, where it doesn't stretch, but it actually breaks. And then you don't get the same kind of end product at the end. And this is why that high fat content butter really matters, because it is a bit more forgiving. And learning when your butter is at that perfect temperature is another one of those things that just takes practice. There's no way to really measure it. You kind of just have to figure out how it feels, and it's always going to be a little different in your kitchen than it is in ours. And so it's very much a matter of just precision, timing, trial and error. And that's part of what makes croissants fun, but also very, very difficult, is that you have all these factors that come together, and there's a very, very, very narrow window in which they all work perfectly. And so trying to figure out how to, get your process and get what you're creating into that space is definitely not something that's easy, but definitely very rewarding.
So some of the main or the most common problems that people have with making croissants in their home, we're going to kind of highlight the main ones, and then Wes is going to explain why that might be happening or why that problem might be occurring. So the first one is that the butter is leaking during baking.
Yeah, this is a common one that I've talked to people. They've said they've run into this. And generally, if you're getting butter leaking out during the baking process, there is an issue with the lamination where the butter kind of soaked into the dough a little bit and it didn't get trapped between the layers. And the other common area is that you let them prove too long before baking them. So when it proves, those layers kind of separate, the butter gets too warm and then it melts in the oven rather than solidifying, or rather than staying where it's supposed to be, and so then it leaks out of the pastry and then you get a very dry, crispy pastry on the inside, which isn't really what we're going for.
The next most common problem is that the croissants are too dense.
At its heart, croissants are a bread dough. Any kind of bread dough, if you're coming up with one that's too dense, it's likely that it was underproofed.
Right, next problem is that there are large holes, or what we call an uneven crumb.
Perfect French croissant, you're going to see that kind of nice honeycomb structure on the inside, and most of those spaces are going to be relatively the same size. They're never all going to be perfectly the same, but they should be really pretty close. If you're having some where they're really big and some are really small, that can happen, and it's usually the result of an overproofed croissant.
And the last problem that people commonly have with croissants is that they lack flavor.
Yeah, generally that's more of an ingredient issue, not using that sourdough starter. Most of the recipes that you're going to find online are really designed to be done in a single day. And to do that, they're predominantly just all yeast. And when you use yeast, you're going to end up with a decent pastry, but you're going to miss out on a lot of that flavor depth that you get with the sourdough starter. Doing it the traditional way, doing it with a sourdough leaven, is definitely a commitment. Ours are about a 3-day process that involves making the dough, laminating, and then baking. But the result is, at least for me, worth the wait and worth the effort.
Yeah, since you've been making the traditional croissant with the sourdough starter base, anytime we have had croissants elsewhere, whether it's at a restaurant or from another bakery, you can tell in the first bite if there is a sourdough starter base or not, because the flavor from those that use the sourdough starter is much more rounded. As we've said, making croissants at home, if you're willing to put in the practice and willing to put in the effort, can be extremely rewarding, but it does require some commitment. So we're going to talk through a few things that can help you at home.
Yeah, the first thing is just being willing to commit to the process. It's going to take practice. They're probably not going to turn out perfect the first time. And if you're lucky, and they are, chances are they're not going to turn out perfect the second time, which is actually what happened to us. And it's just understanding that no matter what happens, if it doesn't turn out the way that you were hoping for, spending the time to try to figure out why that is will help you do better next time and potentially avoid those same problems. The second one is just going to be making sure you're using the right kind of butter. Most of the commercial butter that you're going to find in stores today is going to be around the 80% fat content mark. What we're really looking for when we're making true croissants is we want something more up by like the 84 to 85%, pretty much as you can get. I've had very good luck using Amish roll butter. There's butter that you can buy that's specifically for pastries, that's made for bakeries. And croissants can be a little bit more expensive and difficult to find. But if you live near a specialty grocery store, they might have something like that on hand. You know, the more fat that's in it, the more forgiving that it's going to be on that temperature, and the easier a time you're going to have with that laminating. Just to start small, you know, this is a very tricky process, and trying to manage multiple batches at one time is very hard, especially if you're still kind of figuring the process out and getting the timing and the feel down. Hand roll the croissants out before you do your folds. It just takes a lot more time, and it's a lot more energy and effort.
Well, and that's what we did for part of the first season. Was you did all the croissants by hand with a rolling pin until we were able to afford the laminator.
One of the big ones is just making sure you're using the right flour. You're going to find opinions, you know, across the spectrum when you look online as to what kind of flour to use for a croissant. Some bakers use pastry flour because it makes for a lighter product at the end. Others use nothing but bread flour because you have a higher protein content, you get more gluten, and you get a little bit more stretch. But that can also be tricky as you're trying to shape it, because that dough isn't going to want to stay stretched out, it's going to want to kind of snap back. But on the other hand, if you don't have enough protein and gluten, it can break during the proving process, and then you don't get that nice looking outside. So now for the $64 question, why is it worth the effort? Why should I put in all this time and energy to make a French croissant when I can just go buy some at Costco? I'm glad you asked. The main reason why I would say it's worth it is that fresh warm croissants from your home oven are hard to beat. When they're right out of the oven and they're still crispy and they're a little bit warm on the outside and you go on the inside, it is truly an amazing thing. If you haven't had the chance to experience it, I strongly encourage you to try. One of the other areas is things is most people don't have access to true French croissant. Even if you go to a lot of bakeries, it's a very difficult thing to undertake, and a lot of bakeries, especially in America, unless you live in a major city, it's not worth the effort for them because they wouldn't necessarily sell enough, and so they don't go through all the different steps. And so sometimes for a lot of us, doing it at home is our only option. To me, it's such a beautiful process because we're taking very, very simple ingredients. We're taking butter, salt, water, and flour, and a little bit of sugar and some cream. These are very simple things that most all of us have in our kitchen. And just through some technique and some practice and some patience, we can turn them into this truly beautiful, amazing pastry.
If you tried making croissants yourself, what part of the process did you find the most difficult? Or if you're considering making your own homemade croissants, is there a part of the process that is extremely intimidating to you? Let us know in the comments down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this, and stay tuned for more baking videos. Thanks for stopping by Good Neighbors Homestead, and we'll see you again.
Won't you be my neighbor?
All right, Fred. That was a mixture of Fred and Forrest Gump. Get right. And many people just give up before they, with good reason, not before they even try. What are you?
Off to a great start today.